So, welcome everyone to Transit Talk Episode 1. Here on Transit Talk, we hope to bring a wider discussion of transit into the mainstream, whether that be discussing aviation or rail transit or light rail transit or even water transit. We hope that this will be a space where you can learn more about different transit modes in the country and even around the world. And I think it'll be interesting to hear the perspective of different students. My name is Jack Turner. I am a high school student in Burlingame, California, in between San Jose and San Francisco. So I have a lot of perspectives on California transit, but also regional transit in the Bay Area in general. And I have here my friend Jahao.
Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Jaho. I am from Cincinnati, Ohio. Um, unlike Jack, unlike the San Francisco Bay Area, Cincinnati, Ohio is not particularly blessed with the scope or the quantity of transit options that are available. But like Jack said, here on Transit Talk, this is what we'll be covering on the different aspects and on the development of public transit throughout America and the rest of the world. So I hope you will join us along and you will listen along, and we hope that we can learn you can learn some new things along the way about public transit.
And so today we were envisioning discussing the future of Amtrak in the vein of the recent proposals from a variety of folks, including President Biden, about what they want Amtrak to look like in the future. So, Jahal, I have a question. Have you had a chance to see what Amtrak has proposed, and uh, do you have any thoughts on the service near you in Ohio, and what's Amtrak looking like right now for you?
Yeah, actually, I think this is I think what's important is to first I first want to just ask, in general, like, what were your first impressions when you saw this whole expansion? Because for me, out in here in Ohio, um, you know, this expansion of the routes and of the service, which has primarily focused on cities which are underserved by the network. It's certainly a welcome sight at first, because out here, for example, out here in Cincinnati, we only see currently uh, thrice weekly service from Amtrak, only three times a week, and not even at 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 decent hours of the day, if you will. They come at either 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. On the
Mm-hmm.
Cardinal from Chicago to and from New York. So at first glance, to me, when I heard about this was incredibly welcome news, since I absolutely would love better transit options on Amtrak that's not in the middle of the night and is not restricted to just one line. But I think another thought that I had was also that this expansion doesn't exactly seem to be incredibly feasible, especially given Amtrak's current state. Um, so even though I feel like this is absolutely a beneficial aspect of the expansion of service, I'm not too sure about its feasibility and the realistic probability of this being put in place. Well, let me ask you, what were your first impressions when you heard this news?
Yeah, so in California, we're pretty lucky with the kind of service we get. We have a lot of inner city trains. We also have five overnight trains that run out of the state each day. So we have quite a lot of service now.
Oh,
But
that's
even
so
with that,
lucky, so lucky.
but even with that, we still, I think, could benefit from a lot of service. For example, there really isn't a lot of service in between the Los Angeles and Bay Area. We only get one train in each direction per day that can actually make that trip. So that corridor was something I was excited to see improvements on. And I think also just extending the really profitable routes in the state. We have the Pacific Surfliner from San Diego to San Luis Obispo that is incredibly popular and usually makes some of the most profits of all the trains in the Amtrak system. And the Capital Corridor as well are quite well run and have frequencies. And I think those being extended and expanded, that was something I was really excited about. And I know we're lucky here in California, but I think I was certainly welcoming to the expansion because there are a lot of places where I do think it's necessary, and we also have some of the largest cities in the country. We have Los Angeles, we have San Diego, we have San Francisco, we have San Jose, and we even have the San Joaquin Valley area with Fresno having a lot of people. And these are all key corridors that I do believe will benefit from even more transit service. So I was very welcoming of the service. And on your question of feasibility, I think it's interesting when you consider it from a countrywide standpoint. Of course, California is actually unique because a lot of the services we have are state run. So I think some of the changes that are being proposed can be implemented in a much easier scale, and we'll discuss this more, I imagine. But I think that the feasibility is going to actually vary differently across different states. And uh, do you have any specific opinions on Ohio as for at least the feasibility there? Because of course you only have long distance routes as compared to states like California.
Well, I think first of all, it's important to first of all, present to everyone an introduction of what Amtrak services are currently like. So if you look at a map of the current services, which we will include, you can see that the train lines are really concentrated along the east and west coast. Um, and there's effectively only long distance trains connecting everything in between, which are which like I mentioned um, are incredibly just not accessible for the large populations who live in between. There are also a lot of state-run routes, like you mentioned, which are also primarily concentrated in, for example, states like California or Illinois. So basically, I guess to answer your question, out here in Ohio, we only have right now. There's only two routes. One is the Cardinal, which goes from Chicago to New York via Cincinnati, and the other one is the Lakeshore Limited, which goes again from Chicago to New York via Cleveland. So one in the very south and one running through Ohio in the south and one running through Ohio in the north. So this is why, like I said before, this expansion plan is incredibly welcoming at first, because right now there is no service connecting Ohio internally. For example, Columbus, Ohio, which is a major population center, is just completely ignored by Amtrak service right now. So, what they're proposing to connect to first of all increase services on the existing lines as well as improve expansion within Ohio and the rest of the Midwest, it's certainly, like I said, it's certainly exciting. But then again, because of how Amtrak is, and because of the nature of the geography of the Midwest, this is not the Northeast corridor where there's Boston, New York, Philadelphia, DC, all within 2, 3, 4 hours of each other. This is more second tier cities, if you will,
Yeah, absolutely.
smaller population centers. And in between these population centers, it's not like small towns. In between, it's effectively all cornfields, and maybe with like small stops along the way. So I mean, I would say it's again I've again just to bring up the feasibility. It's not. I wouldn't imagine that it's entirely feasible, and even if it is, it certainly would require a lot of work to be able to get the ridership or the excitement that would entail Amtrak service elsewhere in the country.
And politically, it'll have to pass Congress as well too.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. You know, Amtrak relies very heavily on political. Amtrak relies very heavily on state sponsoring effectively, because a lot of their routes are just huge money losers. They need all the help they can get from the government.
Yeah, and also back to what you mentioned. This is more just a curiosity question, but do you also get a capital limited service in Ohio too that goes to DC? Does that offer services to Ohio as well?
Yeah, the Capital Limited runs effectively on the same track as the Lakeshore Limited. It all goes through northern Ohio. So again, it's not it's not it's not a connector of Ohio internally, if you will.
Yeah, and I get that because it sure seems like the Triple C corridor, the Cincinnati to Cleveland, would be ripe for service, especially if they could expand it to Dayton potentially as well. Because I know that there's a lot of industrial jobs in that region, especially that could probably get a lot of benefit from having train services to these other major city centers
Yeah, for sure. So
as
I
well.
actually I wanna I wanna ask you if if we have a look at this proposed map of expansion services, right? Um, we do see that Amtrak is certainly opening up new corridors in Ohio, connecting Columbus, like you said, as well as, for example, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, as well as establishing, for example, hubs in Atlanta and Denver, which I think are very, you know, I think personally are good expansions there. I want to know what you think of this map. Do you think there are any positives, any negatives of the proposals?
Yeah, well, certainly, as you mentioned, Atlanta and Denver are really. I'm really pleased to see those introduced, especially Atlanta, because Atlanta, being, I believe, in the top 10 in the entire U.S. for population, currently only has one train line a day, and similar to Cincinnati, does not have particularly good hours either. I believe it leaves late in the night going east towards New York on the Crescent, and then it comes early in the morning going towards New Orleans. So again, I think Atlanta has been significantly underserved, and I think also, as the map shows, there's services that are being expanded to Nashville, which also doesn't have any service at all. And that's also another major city that I would be very pleased to see service being expanded there, and also into other cities in Alabama, such as Montgomery. I think that's really great to see out of Atlanta. And Denver, too, as you mentioned, also only has one daily train. It does have the Winter Park Express in the winter, but I think expanding services along the Colorado corridor from Pueblo to Fort Collins and even up to Cheyenne is actually going to be really beneficial too. Given that Denver is also quite a large city that is relatively underserved, albeit popular still, and I think we should capitalize on that popularity. So yeah, I think overall, on your question, I am pleased by the map, and I think the biggest concern I would have had was that there's a lot of these major cities that aren't being connected. Of course, as you mentioned in the beginning, still there's a heavy reliance on these long distance trains to connect city to city pairs, especially from the west coast to the east coast. And I think I would have liked to have more, I guess, interconnectivity between these services to not just rely on long distance routes to get from coast to coast. But of course, with the length of the U.S. being incredibly long, I would think that's difficult on a feasibility scale to do in 15 years. I don't know. You mentioned Atlanta and Denver. Do you have any other positives you would take away from the map?
Yeah, actually, if you if you go online and you read about what you read or you watch what people are talking about in terms of this expanded services, you'll hear that for many people the route they're most excited about is the new connection from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, which I'm sure you can imagine why. But I think that's definitely interesting to consider. You know, especially in terms of the leisure travelers, which Amtrak currently relies quite heavily on. Routes including the Colorado connections or the one from Los Angeles to Las Vegas are certainly
Hmm.
will certainly be beneficial. But I actually wanted to ask you about what you thought of the shortcomings of this map, because I'm sure, as you can see, there are a few gaping holes within this network. You will notice, for example, that um, the two most prominent is that the entirety of South Dakota and the major population centers of, for example, southern Idaho are just completely left off the map. In between, for example, Salt Lake City and up north in Montana, as well as the other hole, which is basically Kentucky, and the fact that the Midwest is almost completely cut off from the South. I saw online that there were even people who when Amtrak released this, they were immediately saying, drawing up better connections of how, for example, there should be a line running from for example, Cincinnati to Atlanta, or how there should
Yeah.
be lines running from, for example, Boise, Idaho to Salt Lake City. Do you think, for example, this is something that Amtrak should prioritize? Is it something that we should be concerned about right now?
Well, you may be disappointed in this answer, but I believe there are some shortcomings that we don't just actually know the reasoning behind. For example, I've actually mapped it before from Miami to Chicago, and it's actually difficult to have a continuity in the track to make a direct route because a lot of times the track ends. The other I think thing we have to consider is that a lot of times they'd be using freight railroads that would be difficult to share track with. So in terms of using existing infrastructure, I think it's difficult for these routes to be created. I do agree with you that these are significant shortcomings, and I would really like to see a connection from Nashville to Louisville, for example, or even from Salt Lake City to maybe even up into Spokane and going through Boise, because that did used to exist with the Pioneer train, and unfortunately Amtrak got rid of that. So I think that would be something that they should consider restoring, especially because Amtrak has shown that they've been able to operate these routes in the past. And I believe they even had a train from Miami to Chicago at one point, and that was discontinued. So I'm a bit surprised as to why they've decided not to continue these. It does look like they have an emphasis on not continuing to expand long distance routes, which is an interesting trend because, of course, these long distance routes are known for being not the biggest money makers for the company. And considering that they have a relatively small budget, at least now, before any of these proposals pass, it's important for Amtrak to focus on profitability. And clearly, they've been doing that with this map, showing that they want to expand the profitable routes, the ones in Southern California, the ones in the Midwest, which are also profitable, especially the Hiawatha route from Milwaukee to Chicago, and also the East Coast. They seem to have a heavy emphasis on it. And I think that brings up an interesting question, which is, do you think Amtrak should be going forward trying to focus on profitability, or should they scale back and focus on services first?
I guess that is the eternal question for Amtrak, right? Because people often have the mistake of comparing the United States with Europe or Asia, and always pointing fingers at why of how the U.S. is so behind in terms of train connectivity. The geography. The fact is, the geography of the United States is just different. There, other than the Northeast and perhaps California, there's really no major areas in the U.S. that lend themselves to really well to train travel, which is why we have which is why we have these long distance routes. Because, for example, if you have a look at, for example, the California Zephyr, the train line between Salt Lake City and Denver, and the one that connects that to Chicago and San Francisco, there's really no cities, no major centers in between San Francisco and Salt Lake City, or Salt Lake City to Denver. There's really no major population centers there, which is, is part of the reason why, for example, it would be completely illogical to operate a high-speed rail there or to operate super frequently there, because
Yeah.
you would only have the passengers that can travel for this massive distance, with nobody getting on or off in between. Which brings back to the eternal question. The Northeast and California, they are pretty well suited for this type of train travel, which is why I think, again, if you look at this map, amidst all the new routes and the excitement of the new services, Amtrak is enhancing, as shown by the yellow lines. They are enhancing the routes centered around New York and DC, and in California and in Chicago. It's really those routes that are the ones that are supplementing the long distance routes, the ones that are losing money. So I definitely think that, as a rule, the more Amtrak can focus on ensuring that they have proper funds to keep operating, is certainly critical, which the people at Amtrak definitely agree with. But again, it's also I think it's also important to consider the other question, which is whether or not Amtrak should be concerned more with expansion, or with expansion as sort of the American train service, or whether it should be focused more on business in making a profit. Because if it were, I suppose if it were up to Amtrak, just if they were left to their own will, these long distance trains would be gone in a snap, because they're really they lose money, which I think again also, like I mentioned before, plays into the sort of unfeasibility of a lot of these routes, because for some of the ones that they are proposing also suffer from this problem of you know routes for the sake of connecting people, but not for ensuring profitability or making money, as they have
Hmm.
in New York or in California. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
and
mhm.
I think I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I think so. Primarily, of course, right now Amtrak is owned by the government. It was nationalized in 1971, and I think that lends itself to right now Amtrak just focusing on operating right now. Of course, they don't have to make a profit, and I know that before COVID, people were actually really excited that they could be turning a profit for the first time in since their existence, essentially. And I think Amtrak has also had a lot of opportunities to cut services if they would like to, but every single time this gets debated in Congress, I think, I'm surprisingly actually, a lot of the conservative senators who have services go through their states, like North Dakota or Montana, have actually opposed eliminating these long distance services because they've actually been really key for their economy and to actually transport workers who, say in like Havre, Montana, don't actually have a lot of other connections to the outside world or to the rest of the country. And I think a lot of times, I think this map shows that Amtrak has continued to focus their emphasis on serving as many people as they can. And of course, being nationalized means they don't have to focus on making a profit. Now, I think expanding services and expanding operations lends itself to being more profitable because you open yourself up to more frequencies and more connections, which will ultimately increase passenger traffic. So I think their extensions, at least, and these expansions show that they want to focus more on profitability because they want to highlight their profitable routes, like the Midwest corridors from Chicago to Milwaukee, for example, or the Northeast corridor from DC to Boston, or even the routes in California. I think those lend themselves to profitability, and I think that'll also help in turn make the long distance routes more profitable by ensuring that they can have the maximum load factor that they can get, which has been increasing over time as these routes grow in popularity. So I think it's really interesting their focus. I think once they start making more money, then they'll focus less on actually just operating and maybe focus more on trying to turn profits every year. Although, of course, as long as they're nationalized, it really won't matter. And I don't know if we're ever going to have the debate over whether rail should be privatized in this country for a while. But for now, I think that's the case.
So effectively, what you're saying is that you think that uh, Amtrak is focusing on serving these people now, but later on in the road, they will focus more on profitability. Right now, it's to expand to as many population centers as possible.
I think Amtrak's goal has always been to be as profitable as they can, and I think they're never going to eliminate these long distance routes because there has been constant opposition in Congress, and I think even if that makes them less profitable, they have still continued to do better and better year after year, and I think ultimately that has came from them increasing service, increasing reliability, increasing their marketing and making it that train travel is competitive in this country, and I think with continued improvements, even if these long distance routes aren't profitable, they're still going to be profitable as an operation and able to continue to expand and improve. Of course, they do need a lot of money right now in order to do that because they don't have a big enough budget to begin with. And that's where these proposals come in. But I think it shows that they're trying to move towards being more self sufficient because I know that's been a long time goal of all of their CEOs going back to 71.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean for sure. Especially since you mentioned, how especially the political influence as well. Those long distance trains, they're not going anywhere. I remember it was either last year or 2 years ago where President Trump actually um, he declared that the long distance trains would be done away with, but because of opposition both from communities served by the routes, as well as the politicians who represent the communities served by the routes. Those plans were those plans to get rid of the long distance routes were ultimately canceled. But I want to I think that also brings up another question, where it's not, since as evident by this map, Amtrak is certainly trying to bring train travel more accessible, bring bring train service to more population centers, um, to more markets, if you will. Do you think that this expansion into new markets is perhaps more important than um, for example, not only expanding the quantity, but expanding the quality as well? Because I'm sure as you know, the quality on Amtrak trains certainly isn't superior. It certainly isn't magnificent. Um, and I
Yeah.
recall, I remember that this one time Amtrak announced that on some of their routes they would be replacing fresh food with packaged
With the
food.
flexible dining, right?
Right, right, right. So I want to pose this question again. I want to pose this question to you. Do you think what do you think is more important, or what do you think Amtrak is going for?
Well, I think we first have to consider just what Amtrak is doing right now, and I think they've actually surprisingly made a lot of investments in the experience. They've ordered new train sets that are actually going to start service soon across all different routes. They've of course bought the Siemens Charger locomotive, the SC44, which is going to be used on their long distance trains coming soon, which will make that the emissions a lot better, which I think will be good overall for passengers. And then they've also said, as of last week, that they're going to reinstate their actual traditional dining service on their West Coast long distance routes, which I know for many is a major reason why they would choose to take those routes in the first place. Now, they have indicated that for profitability reasons, they don't want to introduce traditional dining back onto the East Coast routes, which is unfortunate. They did mention that there may be a timeline for that in the future, but that's not going to happen now. But I think from a budget standpoint, assuming that they have to pick between the two, of course, this map indicates that they can do both. I do think though that it's important to expand into new markets right now, at least from my perspective, just because they're getting new rail cars. They're getting better with on time performance. They've had better relationships with the freight companies. I think at this point we need to create a situation where people know that there is a rail option, and not having service isn't going to convince anybody to ride a train. I think, for example, like right now, just in a bigger city, if you take away a bus route and you don't implement it back for a while, as people start coming back onto trains again with COVID, I think it's important that we keep services intact to incentivize people to take trains. Or else, right now, they're just going to be into the mindset that, oh, we don't have a train service, let's just drive or let's just fly. So I think it's critical that we introduce service to as many places as we can, and using Amtrak's new rolling stock that they've developed across all different types of routes, their new high-speed Avelia Liberty trains and their new Siemens cars. I think expanding that and expanding their services, and of course, I would expect that with this new budget, they can probably likely afford traditional dining for all of their routes. So I think my first goal at least would be for expanding service. But what do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting that you brought up the point of how we need to Amtrak should prioritize, you know, having more people know that there is a train option available, because that is certainly a very big concern, and a very big problem with train travel in the United States in general. First of all, because of the lack of service, people are just so accustomed to driving. Um, you know, for example, if your specifications for travel don't line up exactly with the limited service that we have, you're not going to take the train. For example, if I here right now in Ohio, if I wanted to go to Nashville right now, I do not have any train option available. And even if I wanted to go somewhere that did have a train option, if I wanted to drive from Cincinnati to Indianapolis, well, my only option would just be to travel, would just be to take the train at 1 a.m. and then get there, in the morning, effectively.
Yeah.
So, I think that's that's certainly of merit of expanding service so that there are more options available in terms of train travel. But I think another important factor we have to consider is the American culture of driving, because I'm sure, as you know, unlike other countries in Europe or in Asia, America prides itself on roads. America prides itself on its robust outdoor auto industry, and how America
Hmm.
is a country connected by roads. Um, I think this sentiment is certainly strong out here in the Midwest and more rural areas, which is also why, for example, it's really only in on the big cities of the East and West Coast that people really commute by train or by subway or by public transit in large numbers, whereas out here in the Midwest and in other rural areas, number one, there isn't the transit option available, but number two, there is a culture of driving cars. I don't know. Do you think this is something of concern? Do you think it's something that this culture, it's something that Amtrak is trying to or should try to change?
I think yes, they should definitely try to change it, but I think it also it's a bit nuanced. I mean, at least a lot of time, at least the introduction of this auto culture, I think, was driven in large part by lobbyists and by companies like Ford or Chrysler that tried to bring these American products like automobiles into the mainstream, and they often did that through the reduction of railroad services. Now, I think a lot of times uh, cars will be competitive with shorter trains if the trains are slow, and in that case, I think that's where a lot of people choose to drive over taking the train. But I think if you could have longer distance trains potentially that are run at high speeds, like San Diego to Los Angeles, for example, if you can increase the speed there or increase the frequencies there, that can very well compete with cars. And I think those kinds of trips are trips that Amtrak should be focusing on, and even the long distance trains, because I think for many, having the ability to sleep overnight on a train or get food on a train would be preferable than driving overnight or having to spend the money to get gas or whatnot, or to potentially stay at a hotel or at a motel. And I think there's are a lot of cases where Amtrak has a lot of potential to be competitive with driving and with getting rid of this car culture, which I personally do think is actually going away. And I think a lot of people are shifting away from cars in the advent of climate change, and with the lack of electric vehicle chargers around the country. I think this poses a prime situation for Amtrak to expand, and I think that's why it's so key that they share their plans now so that we can implement these plans.
Yeah, so I wanted to actually, if I could shift the conversation a bit, I want to go back to the point of feasibility, because if you look at this map again, you'll notice not only the specific connections they have, but you'll also notice the quantity of how many new routes or enhanced routes that they are planning. Um, it Amtrak wants to implement all of this. They say by 2035, which if you actually think about it is not a long time at all. And this would include the aforementioned uh, services with Denver and Atlanta as hubs, the new services in the Midwest, including Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, as well as some in the East Coast and the West Coast. Well, do you think 2035 is a realistic date for the completion of all of this? And if not, do you think that there are some that just won't go through?
I think there's a yes to all of your questions, and I think it's interesting because of course none of this has been passed so far, and we see that there's not a lot of opportunity for it probably to pass this year with the political situation, and I would highly doubt any of this occurring if Republicans were to regain control of Congress. So in terms of it actually occurring by 2035, I think the prospects are slim. Now, of course, it can be completed by 2035, and we've seen rapid development in other countries. Like China has built an extensive high-speed rail network in like 15 years' time, and certainly I would think that could be replicated here if we can get people to get around to do it. Now, that is not going to happen, and I think with that, there will be a lot of routes that will get cut. And one of the routes I'm particularly intrigued by is the Los Angeles to Las Vegas corridor, as you mentioned, because that is actually being built in conjunction with also Brightline West's proposal to build a train from Las Vegas to Victorville. So I think it's going to be interesting where private companies are now trying to fill the void that Amtrak can't fill, where it's not feasible for Amtrak to build it because they have other routes they want to focus on. And especially with the route where a higher speed train like this Brightline West train would compete with Amtrak. So I think those are the kinds of routes that I would expect to be cut. Uh, and it would be great if Amtrak could offer service to Las Vegas, but I think it'll be difficult if private companies start coming in and taking over operations, because Amtrak clearly has not shown a willingness to do things in a timely manner, of course, and even run their trains in a timely manner. So I think that'll be interesting. Uh, I'm curious your thoughts. Do you have particular routes that you would be concerned about being cut?
I mean, I would say again, well, first of all, definitely 2035 is not realistic for all of this to go through, since the United States is not, it's not like China where whatever the government says goes, and there's not a lengthy period of debate and discussion within the government, but I think in terms of the actual routes, like you said, for example, Los Angeles to Las Vegas, where private companies are coming in, that certainly poses challenges. I would say, if Amtrak is able to get going, the private company factor, it may actually help in acting as a competitor, because you know Amtrak nationalization, it would effectively be going back a blast to the past, where instead of just one overarching train service provider, there were effectively operating in a private model where many different companies competed with each other. So I think there is a slight prospect that in some of these routes, especially like you mentioned in California or perhaps in Florida, where there's also private rail companies springing up, there might actually be competition with Amtrak, which could also help Amtrak to as an incentive to improve services and to get this built faster. But again, I think coming back to the Midwest, the areas I'm most familiar with, I look at this and I think, man, this is not feasible at all. For example, Amtrak proposes extending train service to Green Bay and to Duluth, Minnesota, which they are certainly cities geographically. They are certainly geographically spread, but there's already a very limited number of people who want to travel to the second tier cities via train. For example, by Minneapolis, or to Omaha, right? Those are second tier cities effectively, which have train service now, and certainly have less ridership than they could. So I think
Yeah.
expansion to even smaller cities such as Green Bay or Duluth, it's definitely not it's definitely not one which I would say has bright prospects, because again, it's not like expanding service to Las Vegas or to Phoenix, or to Nashville, which are pretty 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 decently sized cities, which are just completely unserved. Those services are I'll say this: if they can't get a decent amount of state funding, I don't think routes like that will survive. But other than that, I think it really just does come down to, we really do need to see how Amtrak goes about this. Which is actually, it's an interesting thing to consider. If Amtrak were starting this, do they start all of them at one time, or do they, gradually take steps? What do you think would be the most sensible way to approach it?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think they would probably prioritize their most profitable routes first before the services, like you mentioned, to Duluth. In fact, the Duluth one may be an interesting case because I believe there has been a private company that has proposed introducing that segment. But I think if they're looking to focus on those routes, they should secure state sponsors for those first, because I don't think it will be very feasible at all for them to do it on a national level. And also, just in general, I think when you look pre-nationalization, nearly every single route at that point in 1970 at least was not profitable at all, and I think it'll be difficult for private companies to at least to build up and to have a lot of scale previously already to actually make profits on these lines. So I think it will be difficult, like you said, to operate these smaller scale routes from private companies, which will mean that it will likely never happen for probably another 30 years until Amtrak can get around to doing it. So unfortunately, I think the reality is that Amtrak is gonna be like what is happening in general, where people go towards the money first, and where cash is king. And I think that the cash is going to be coming out and primarily from these bigger cities like Chicago or the East Coast or the West Coast. It's my hope that they can focus on these smaller routes, but I think those will ultimately come after their extensions and expansions to these big cities that'll make them more money.
Mhm. Yeah, unfortunately, that is how capitalism works. You follow the money. So actually, I think another interesting point I would like to bring up, and this is perhaps another aspect to consider. If you look at the map, you'll notice that Amtrak wants to initiate two new international routes. One of which is an extension of their current service. One of which is, the extension one is the extension one is expanding their current service from New York to St. Albans, Vermont, all the way up to Montreal. And the second one, which I think is far more interesting, is a new route from Detroit to Toronto. Now, I have driven that corridor numerous times. It is currently only served by Via Rail Canada. So,
Hmm.
I'm curious to know what you think of this, because then Amtrak would be coming into, number one, competition with their Canadian counterpart, but also number two, um, it would also provide more international connections for the Amtrak network, which is currently only limited to, again, the very east and the very west coasts. What do you think of these international routes?
Yeah, international routes I think are difficult for Amtrak, especially with the time aspect, because it's difficult to have border crossings and those and the checkpoints, which I think will make it hard for these services to be attractive time wise. Now, I think with the Detroit to Toronto section is interesting because, like you said, there is already an existing line that goes from Windsor to Toronto, and it would just be extending passenger service from Detroit to Windsor, which I think is completely viable and completely an option. And I think in reality, Amtrak and Via Rail aren't necessarily going to be true competitors in a sense, because there's obviously not a lot of frequency on the line right now from Windsor to Toronto at least. And I think if anything, if we can just bolster the frequencies across different agencies, that will be great, because Via Rail and Amtrak are in relatively similar situations where they have similar rolling stock and they have both struggled with profitability in the past. So I think it's encouraging to see that there's a lot of international expansion, and I think the Detroit to Toronto route would actually be really beneficial, because I know Michigan in the past has struggled at least economically, especially with the downturn of the auto industry, and I think creating connections to other economic centers will be really key. Uh, and I know that the Vermonter as well that goes to St. Albans is actually it's a pretty popular route for people looking to go to Vermont, and I think expanding opportunities for Canadians to come into Vermont is actually quite exciting as well. So overall, I would look at it really positively, and I would definitely not be wary of competition. I know that airline competition has certainly lowered down prices and increased people's willingness to get on planes, and I think that if there's more market diversity in a sense from Windsor to Toronto and even on to Detroit, that'll increase people's willingness to take the train, and on a corridor where I think the train can actually be competitive with the car, because there's not a lot of topography that's going to hinder speed. That would be a great opportunity for new train ridership, and I'm glad to see that Amtrak is focusing on it. I don't know how that's going to fit into their overall priorities, and if you have thoughts on that, I'd be interested to hear that, of course, because they may focus more on domestic routes.
Actually, I, I,
Uh,
I want to ask you just a very quick, interesting question, which is, you'll notice that Amtrak on the map, Amtrak has it listed as a new Amtrak service. which is basically to say that it's not the Maple Leaf, it's not the dually operated via rail Amtrak service from New York to Toronto. It's like what the Amtrak service to Montreal is, where it's only Amtrak serving. I want to ask you, do you think there's a possibility of, for example, Via Rail Canada having its own routes extending into the United States, for example, to Chicago or to other population centers, for example?
I'd imagine it would be. It's certainly possible. I think it would be difficult for them to expand too far into the U.S., of course, because then they'd be dealing with freight companies who own the tracks, who already make it difficult enough for Amtrak. Uh, but I think it's viable for them to expand into the U.S. And I don't really know. I don't honestly don't think it's going to be much different from Amtrak expanding into Canada because they provide the same service essentially with the same quality, similar pricing, similar delays, similar. They're very they're quite similar Amtrak and Via Rail, and to my knowledge, there's nothing prohibiting Via Rail from expanding. I know sometimes it's marketed that Via Rail operates the joint Maple Leaf service, so I think it's sometimes confusing enough for passengers. But certainly, I would not be surprised if Via Rail expanded into the U.S. And I think that'd be great
Hmm.
in general because then it would promote Canadians to come into the U.S. more on the train.
Huh, yeah. So I mean, maybe, if all this goes through, there is a possibility you might be seeing Canadian trains in the US more often.
I would certainly welcome that. That'd be a great sight.
Well, I don't think they'll go all the way down to California, but again, like even with these international routes, the one from Detroit to Toronto, I think that again that it's also another example of the shortcomings of this Amtrak expansion, because for example, we take that my family me I take that corridor from Detroit to Toronto. We drive there all the time. But we first have to drive there from Cincinnati, and as you can see, again there is that lack of connection directly um, between these cities. Based on what Amtrak is proposing. If I wanted to go to Toronto on their new network, I would have to take the train first all the way up to Cleveland, and then back out west to Toledo, and then go up to Detroit, and then from there finally get on the new route. So I would say again, even though Amtrak is opening up a lot of these new routes, if you live elsewhere on the network, there's still the gaps in the service which can hinder your ability to easily get from one place to another, as is the case right now, on the current Amtrak network.
Yeah, and you make it a really interesting point to me, which is that for people like you have this desire to go from a point to a specific point, and I think it would be difficult because someone, say in Boise, may want to go to Toronto, and of course that's not even possible in Amtrak. And I think that in a way brings up the how Amtrak should be reorienting their route network. Like, should they focus on enabling point-to-point connections and having trains to go from like Oklahoma City to Cincinnati or something like that, or should they, like they're kind of already doing, being more of like a hub and spoke system where they have routes that merge into different hubs like Chicago or Cleveland, and then they have smaller services that branch off to other cities. In a way, it's very representative of the airline models of many of the legacy carriers that
Oh
operate the
yeah,
hub and spoke
for sure,
system.
for sure. Yeah, no. I mean, a lot of the big airlines, they all operate out of the big cities, whereas other maybe more low cost carriers, they operate direct from point to point. But I think in terms of rail travel, it's impossible to have a real point to point model, because there's only so many people, as you say, for example, who want to go from Oklahoma City to Cincinnati, or who, for example, want to go from Salt Lake City to Houston, right? It's impossible to have those sorts of direct connections like that, especially with second tier cities and less populated areas. So I don't think, like I said before, for example, connecting Cincinnati with the Detroit to Toronto network, I don't think we will see that. And I don't think that is even on Amtrak's very long term plan. Um, I think what they're trying to do with this new network, in a sense, is to is to is to is to establish not only new connections from their existing hubs, but also to establish new hubs in general. Because as we talked about Denver and Atlanta, but also, for example, Cleveland, um, which is seeing four new routes, or for example, even Los Angeles, which has that new service to not only Las Vegas but also to Phoenix, Arizona. So I would say that for a lot of for a lot of people who want to integrate train travel into their work or into for example their own travels for family purposes or whatever, it's still not going to be an option for the great majority of the country, because there just isn't that point to point possibility. Now, this service could and definitely will be this expanded service definitely will be of use to the people who, for example, say, you know, want a better connection between Atlanta and Montgomery, Alabama, for example, because of the new route that's going to be operated. But in terms of, again, in terms of like, for the vast majority of the country, train travel still remains. Train travel will still remain a very unaccessible option. And I feel that, even with this whole expansion project, although we talked about before how Amtrak wants to improve awareness of a train option, I don't feel like they will be able to do that just because of the inherent lack of the point to point model, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, one topic I'm particularly interested in considering, and I'm curious your thoughts about this, is that so recently Amtrak introduced sleeper services on their Northeast Regional service, and I guess one of the markets that Amtrak could tap into that is popular but really isn't, I think, is capitalized on enough is this night train market that in a lot of cases you can use an Amtrak train to spend the night on, and you won't have to pay, and you pay for your ticket in your room essentially with your seat, and then you can get into your destination overnight. And I think that could be an option for a lot of people. Do you think expanding into markets like that and to creating more night services could be a potential to attract new travelers, and whether there's any viability with night trains as there are in Europe where they're very common?
Huh. That is an interesting proposition of bringing these sorts of night trains to the new expanded network. I would feel, based on my own opinions of the current state of affairs, that the night trains would not be feasible at all, because we have to consider take what kind of people take Amtrak right now, right? We either have the business travelers who, for example, are taking the trains in the Northeast corridor between DC and New York, or if you're Joe Biden from Delaware to DC, um, or we have the leisure travelers who are taking the long scenic routes out west. So the night train is not suitable for either one of those. Um, you know, effectively, for most business travelers, they're not going to be taking the train from Chicago to Los Angeles, for example. They're not going to spend 3 days on a train. They're going to take a plane and get there in a couple of hours. Um, the only time train travel would be feasible for them is if, like I said, they're in the Northeast corridor where the destinations are also a few hours apart. And of the leisure travelers who do take the long trains out, you know, they are there for quite a long time. They're for like, days, multiple days at a time even. So you're either so for the people who do travel Amtrak, it has to be a specific group of people who are traveling who neither have a great desire who I'm sorry, who neither have a great rush to get to their destination, nor have, you know, nor be traveling for any specific nor be traveling for any business or leisure related purposes. So I feel, expanding the night train services beyond what they have now on the long distance services, it really wouldn't be too 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 necessary or wanted or desired, in terms of the network. And as we already seen from the dismal service that, for example, Cincinnati or Houston get now, running trains in the dead of night, especially when they stop at cities, is just completely inconvenient for absolutely everybody, and also diminishes the want for trains in general. You know?
Yeah, and I agree with you. Although I do think that surprisingly, Amtrak has shown there is a sweet spot for these kinds of services. At least, particularly during the COVID pandemic, one of the routes that Amtrak has offered that's managed to actually stay profitable to the point where they haven't even cut any of their dining is the auto train, where it would leave. I believe it leaves close to like 8 p.m. at night from Sanford, Florida, and it arrives in Lorton, Virginia, in the morning. And those kinds of services where you can, I guess, with the auto train, bring your car. But these like 14-hour, 12-hour train journeys have shown to be relatively effective for leisure travelers, or even business travelers to some degree, who need to either have a car to be in their destination in the next morning. And I wonder, I think, for me personally, I see there could be some markets where if you have that sweet spot of like a 12 to 14-hour journey, maybe it can be effective, especially if you market it to people who can bring their cars.
Huh. I mean, that is, huh. From Florida to basically, you end up outside DC in the morning. Does the train stop like along the way?
No, it goes directly from Florida to DC.
Huh. I mean, I guess that certainly would be an option. But again, it would have to be basically timed pretty well. So it certainly wouldn't be an option for many people who maybe live slightly too far or slightly too close to a major destination. But I mean, that's definitely interesting. Night trains where you take your car along.
Yeah, certainly it's a very niche market that I think would have to be executed pretty well to the degree that the auto train currently is, and I'm not sure if there's the possibility for Amtrak to do that right now outside of that corridor.
I think it's definitely a option, but it's since there's a sweet spot, it's definitely a option. But I mean, it is very niche, as you said. It's not. It targets a very you have to be part of a very specific population, a very specific customer base to to want this sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so I think that's about all the time we have for today. But I actually wanted to ask you one final question, um, which is, being from San Francisco, um, right now, like with these expansion plans in front of you, um, do you envision travel anywhere would be more more easy for you effectively? For example, let's say when you go to Las Vegas or Phoenix or elsewhere, do you envision yourself taking the train rather than the plane or driving for any of those for any of the destinations with these new and improved services?
I think I do, and while I would be more optimistic if I still lived in San Diego because I did use the Surfliner quite frequently. Um, I think I see a couple possibilities. Well, first of all, I think outside of Amtrak, there is the possibility of high speed rail in California. Of course, they've cut that back to the point where it's only going to serve the Central Valley, and I have never had to be in the Central Valley for anything, so I don't know if I would utilize that service. But I'm excited about the possibility of more services from Los Angeles to San Francisco because I have had to go to Los Angeles before, and I used to have family that lived there. Um, and I've driven down there many times to visit people there. And I think if there's more possibilities to go from San Jose to the Santa Barbara, Ventura, Los Angeles area, I would definitely use that Unfortunately, one of the biggest changes I would want to see is slightly better timing on the California Zephyr, especially arriving in Salt Lake City. I would prefer it to not arrive at 3 a.m. That would be more conducive to me using it because I would have intentions to go to Salt Lake City on the train. But I think I'm excited about the expanded services to Southern California because I've actually never taken the train down there, and we've theorized it many times, but the timing really isn't conducive to daily use or widespread use. And I think that is one place where I'm excited about if it were to actually occur. I'm curious about you because you live in Ohio where there's obviously less service. Do you see yourself riding Amtrak more with these changes?
I will be honest. I'll be completely honest. The expansion, it's it seems like there's a lot of new expansion in the Midwest, but again, with the lack of the point to point connectivity, I don't think it will really make a change, especially for me, because although there are a lot of new services, um, there there are only two for me personally. For me, Columbus and Indianapolis, right? Those two new routes, um, for which again, like I said, you would really need to have all, like, for example, your time and you know your purpose all lined up pretty well. For example, when you go to the other, because for example, these lines, they are not made primarily for leisure travel. They are not made for a scenic getaway right out here in the Midwest.
Hmm.
um I feel that there certainly are uses for them, and if this gets implemented, I certainly will make good use of them. But again, with the limitations on the point to point, as well as the limitations on the real amount of services that are available, since like I said before, all of Kentucky is basically there's a gap in the network. um, I feel that the the usability, if you will, of the service, how much I will actually take it, will probably be a lot less um, than how much I want to take it. Let's say that, because um, because you're definitely more excited for the idea, but putting it into practice into everybody's daily lives is another story.
Yeah, especially with the auto culture that's so rampant as we've discussed.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we we love our cars in the Midwest.
And that does not seem to be changing anytime soon.
All right, excellent. So I think that's about all the time we have for today. I want to thank everybody for listening in. And I without for without anything else, if you want to add, Jack, I look forward to everybody joining in the next episode.
Yeah, I do just want to add that you should look forward to our next episode. The likely plan is to be discussing uh, what we believe are the best transit networks in the United States, so stay tuned for that. It should be exciting.